Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. And as we always do, we got a great show for you today. We have with us today Professor John Mearsheimer, who is recognized as an absolute expert on all things that has to do with the Russia-Ukraine war and has for decades, for that matter. And he's currently I think you call it an international relations theorist, right? Isn't that kind of what your title is, and then a professor at the University of Chicago?
That's correct, Danny.
Well, we're so grateful to have you, because one of the things that makes you very unique is that you do have the theory, but you also have the practicality, and you talk about ground truth reality, which puts you in pretty rarefied air, in my view. And so we're very grateful to have you on the show today. Welcome to Deep Dive.
Thank you.
So let's just jump right into it. So as we always do, we always set the stage for the discussion that's going to follow, but we're actually going to back up a little bit, even more so to this show, because I guess the last week or so, I was doing some research for a show that we're going to do at the end of the year, kind of a wrap up of this all nearly 2 years of the war. And then also looking at things that are happening with the Israeli Hamas fight, with some things in Asia. And we were going to relook at Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations to see, did he have the right idea? And are things kind of breaking down along those lines there? And while I was doing it, I got the book right here. I was reading a passage that caught my attention when he was trying to talk about some of the people who don't have it right. And this is written in 1993, by the way. He said a status paradigm, for instance, leads John Mearsheimer to predict that the situation between Ukraine and Russia is ripe for the outbreak of security competition between them. Russia and Ukraine might overcome their dynamic and learn to live together in harmony, he said, but it would be unusual if they did. He was saying that, no, he doesn't have it right here. That's not going to happen. And yet you were one of the few back in 1993 that, in fact, had it exactly right. And if we can just show that you actually wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs from which he was drawing here, that showed even more prescience. And I'm just going to pull a couple things out here, but gracious, I mean, I could almost read the whole thing because it's so prescient in what actually happened. Gary, if you could pull that one. You wrote, great powers that share a long and unprotected common border like that between Russia and Ukraine often lapse into competition driven by security fears. Russians and the Ukrainians neither like nor trust each other. The grim history that has passed between these two people provides explosive material that could ignite conflict between them. Now, I'm just curious, what did you see back then that nobody else saw?
Well, it's important to emphasize that NATO expansion, which we now talk about as the principal cause of the conflict, is really only one of two causes. The other cause was what was happening in the Donbass, the fight between the Ukrainian government and the Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in the Donbass who were deeply dissatisfied with what was going on inside of Kyiv. So you effectively had a civil war inside eastern Ukraine.
Wait. You're saying that was back in the 90s?
No, I'm saying that's today.
Oh, today. Yeah.
That's today. In other words, what I'm saying, it's important to understand that there are two dimensions that underpin the war today. One, and most importantly, is NATO expansion. And number two was the civil war in eastern Ukraine and Russia's commitment to protect the near abroad. Okay, I just want to make it clear that those two causes are present with the ongoing war in Ukraine. Back in 1993, there was no threat of NATO expansion, certainly no threat of NATO expansion into Ukraine. But what I saw was the possibility of a war breaking out because there was a large Russian ethnic minority and a large number of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine who did not get along well with the ethnic Ukrainians. So I saw potential for real trouble inside of Ukraine that would draw in the Russians. And you want to remember, Danny, back in the early 1990s, when I wrote this, there was significant ethnic conflict in the Balkans. And
Right.
for people who focused on the Balkans, and I focused on the Balkans at that point in time, it was, I think, easy to surmise conflict inside of Ukraine between the ethnic Ukrainians and those who were sympathetic to Russia. And again, that drawing the Russians in. So I figured the best way for Ukraine to survive, given the population differential between the two countries, and given that Russia was a richer country, it made good sense for Ukraine to keep the nuclear weapons that it inherited when the Soviet Union fell apart in December 1991.
Yeah, that was a really controversial position back then, as I recall, because a lot of people were saying, "Yeah, no, let's don't have all these nukes floating around in all these former Soviet countries, or even two. Let's just consolidate them all into Moscow." So that I think the idea was that so we can control them better. I mean, what do you think was behind that? Why did people want to move the nukes into Moscow and take them out of Ukraine?
Well, the Russians obviously did not want Ukraine to have nuclear weapons. The Ukrainians, for the most part, wanted to keep their nuclear weapons, but they were not terribly motivated to do so at the time. Uh, and in the West was really the main driving force here, in my opinion. There was a widespread feeling that we had reached the end of history and that, wars between countries like Russia and Ukraine just weren't going to happen in the future. That was
Yeah.
all behind us. And it's very interesting to note that back then, a number of people who opposed my position argued that Ukrainians and Russians are basically blood brothers and blood sisters. This is the argument that
Yeah.
Putin laid out in his famous July 12th, 2021 written essay. People were making that argument back in the early 1990s. And when I said, look, there is real potential for conflict in Ukraine, similar to what you see in the Balkans, people said, no, Russians and Ukrainians can live together. Again, they're blood brothers and blood sisters. I didn't believe that. And sadly, I think I proved correct.
Now, as I recall, that the driver for this effort wasn't even so much the Russians as it was President Clinton. Can you walk us through a little bit about what was dynamics going on both at home and abroad that led him to that conclusion?
Well, first of all, President Clinton, like all American presidents, does not like nuclear proliferation. And our basic view is that the less countries that have nuclear weapons, the better. In fact, from our point of view, the ideal situation is one where only one country has nuclear weapons.
Right.
Us, right?
Right.
So there were four countries that ended up with nuclear weapons as a result of the Soviet Union breaking apart. One was Belarus, two was Kazakhstan, three was Ukraine, and four, of course, was Russia. And we understood the Russians were going to keep their nuclear weapons. But what we wanted to do was get the nuclear weapons that were in Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine out of their hands and give them to Moscow. And the only country we had any trouble with was Ukraine. And Clinton moved very forcefully to compel Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons, again, because of how we thought about nuclear proliferation.
Yeah.
It's also clear that the Russians badly wanted those nuclear weapons back for obvious reasons. And Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin had very good relations at the time. And we thought that it made good sense to accommodate Yeltsin. And then finally, as I said, I think most people felt that Ukraine didn't need those nuclear weapons because we were now in the era of peace, love, and dope. The conflicts of the past were not going to come back to haunt us. And we really had nothing to worry about.
Yeah.
So it looked like a win-win-win situation. And Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons.
It didn't look like that. It certainly hasn't worked out that way. And actually, you mentioned that just before we went on air, and our great executive producer, Gary Villapiano, actually found that clip that Clinton said just a little while ago, not too long ago, that it was a mistake for him to have done that. Gary, see if you can roll that.
Putin broke it and first took Crimea. And I feel terrible about it because Ukraine is a very important country. And I feel a personal stake because I got them to agree to give up their nuclear weapons, and none of them believe that Russia would have pulled this stunt if Ukraine still had their weapons.
Man, it's like he was listening to you, because that's exactly what he said. Because I guess at the time, everybody's thinking, In fact, I remember when the first of this war came out, I took a lot of heat from some people because I said that, look, that the Ukraine can't win this. Russia is not looking to go further, beyond Ukraine. And a lot of people said, no. Putin wants to go all the way to the English coast. He wants to go into take Russia. This is a land grab. He wants to recreate the Soviet Union. But there was a lot more going on there than that. And the idea that, Ukraine was not going to be able to, to hold off the Russians for a long time, I think was going to be a bit of a problem.
Well, I think that you and I, with regard to the present war, the one that started on February 24th, 2022, have been two of a handful of people who have argued that the Russians would win the war, that Ukraine ultimately could not stand up to the Russians. If you looked at the population balance between the two sides, if you looked at the industrial base inside Russia and the industrial base inside Ukraine, and so forth and so on. And we're going to be proved correct, of course, because the Russians are now on the march and Ukraine is in desperate straits. But what I saw back then was that if a war were to break out, the Russians would defeat the Ukrainians at the conventional level. Conventional deterrence would not work. If you looked at the geography of eastern Ukraine, if you looked at the areas where the Russians might invade, it was easy for the Russians to just drive right across the border into Ukraine, and they would be up against a Ukraine that was not very powerful. And you want to remember back then, back in the early 1990s, the United States and NATO was not committed to defending Ukraine the way it has been since 2022. So the Ukrainians would have been pretty much on their own, and they were certainly doomed at the time.
Well, and I think that to your point a second ago, at the time that was done, a lot of people said, I think it was called the Budapest Memorandum. I may be getting the name wrong, where an agreement was signed by all these folks, and we so-called said for the independence of Ukraine, and a lot of people said that was like an Article 5 deal, that we should have gone in and actually supported them in the meantime. But when that was done, nobody thought, correct me if I'm wrong, because you were engaged at the end, but nobody thought that Ukraine and Russia were going to fight. So that negotiation was to prevent Russia from going in there, but from outside of that. So no one ever expected those two to fight, I don't think, other than you.
Well, I just thought there was a significant possibility, but it's very important to understand that we did not on purpose make an ironclad decision or commitment to defend Ukraine. I mean, if you go back and look at the wording of the Budapest Memorandum that you're referring to, we made sure it did not look like an Article 5 commitment, because even though we thought there was hardly any chance of a war breaking out between Ukraine and Russia, we understood there was a sliver of a chance, and we did not want to be committed. And that was, what the world looked like at that point in time.
Yeah. So I want to jump ahead to kind of the rest of our time here. I want to jump ahead to kind of where we are right now and the lay of the land heading into the real heart of the winter, and then get your projections on where you think this might end up going, what it might look like. But first of all, a lot of shaky things going on right now, because Sullivan's been doing a lot of talking here recently, and there are some claims, especially by some in the Ukrainian armed forces, that if we don't come across with this money that they've been trying to get, that Biden's been trying to get, that could cause them to lose the war.
Ukrainian President Zelensky's top aide today warning without more U.S. military aid, Ukraine faces a big risk of losing the war.
Any member of Congress who does not support funding for Ukraine is voting for an outcome that will make it easier for Putin to prevail.
There's been a fierce debate over that funding on Capitol Hill, with House Republicans insisting on accountability for American funds already sent to Ukraine, and demanding that Democrats first agree to toughening restrictions at the U.S.-Mexico border.
The battle is for the border. We do that first as a top priority.
Now, J.D. Vance over in the Senate side says, let's not get on the fast track of this money. In fact, here's what he had to say.
On the Ukraine question in particular, everybody with a brain in their head, Jake, knows that this was always going to end in negotiation. The idea that Ukraine was going to throw Russia back to the 1991 borders was preposterous. Nobody actually believed it. So what we're saying to the president and really to the entire world is you need to articulate what the ambition is. What is $61 billion going to accomplish that $100 billion hasn't?
Those are some really good questions that he said there right at the end. But when he said at the beginning that nobody thought that this was going to end anyway, negotiated settlement, I'm not sure that's right, because there seem to be many in the administration that actually think that, no, this is still winnable. And in fact, as long as you give the money, it's going to be. And Sullivan ended by saying this.
How can the U.S. better enable and empower Ukraine to actually breach Russian defenses and win the war instead of sustaining their current fight?
When this war started in February of 2022, the experts were predicting that Ukraine would fall in a week. Today, Kyiv stands, and Ukraine stands as a sovereign, independent country because of the funding that we've provided to Ukraine. And that is thanks first to the bravery of the Ukrainian forces, but second, to the arms and supplies that the United States and the international coalition has provided to them. So if we can sustain those supplies, it can continue to make progress on the battlefield. And equally importantly, it can continue to resist efforts by Russia to take more Ukrainian territory. And that is basically fundamentally in the interests of the United States, because if Russia succeeds in this fight against Ukraine, all of Europe is at risk.
Okay. There's two things I really want to point out about there. I could go a lot. We could spend the whole hour on that, or a whole hour on that, probably that one clip there. But Gary, if you can bring up that battle map that we have of Ukraine, when you take a look at this is the current situation here, but it's also almost indistinguishable from the one in November of 2022 after the Russians withdrew from Kherson City. And there hasn't been any change. We spent $113 billion. We sent them 5,000 U.S. military vehicles of all different types, millions of artillery shells, hundreds of millions of rounds, and it didn't dent the surface. So the idea that we need to give more money so that even after Ukraine has lost, who knows what the real number is, it could be as many as 500,000 people, that somehow more money is going to get them to go through is just militarily nonsense. But yet you have Sullivan actually saying, no, actually they need to, because if they don't, then they're going to go, if we don't stop Putin, they're going to go all the way into the West and everyone will be at stake. And look, that is just completely nonsense. If that whole map that I just put up there, you saw that's after almost 2 years of war. That's all of Ukraine that they've been able to get. Now, I think that probably they're going to end up with more of that, maybe all 4 of those oblasts, but I doubt they go much further than that. I don't know that they have the capacity, but they definitely don't have the capacity to threaten a 32-member alliance that does have Article 5 guarantees, that does have powerful air forces, navies, and and well-trained troops and high-tech capabilities. Russia will never do that. That would be political suicide, or actual national suicide, which I don't think they're going to do. So I think the very premise that the administration is going down here is just not true.
Well, a couple points. I mean, as you said, we could talk for a couple hours about that one clip because there's so many really outrageous statements in it. First of all, I don't believe the Russians are going to try to conquer all of Ukraine, much less move into other countries in Eastern Europe. The Russians would be crazy to try to conquer the western part of Ukraine because it's filled with ethnic Ukrainians who hate the Russians, and they would have a large-scale occupation that would be a nightmare. Furthermore, I think what's going on here is that Sullivan is engaging in scare tactics because he thinks it is the only way he's going to get the money from Congress. This is good old-fashioned threat inflation, which American administrations are brilliant at.
Really good at, right.
So that's what's going on here. Another very important point here is that you don't want to focus too much on how much territory the Russians have conquered versus how much territory the Ukrainians have conquered. This is a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, what matters the most is the casualty exchange ratio. And in this case, the casualty exchange ratio decisively favors the Russians. The Russians have killed many more Ukrainians than Ukrainians have killed Russians. And because the Russian population is about 5 times as big as the Ukrainian population, this is a huge problem. Furthermore, and this point cannot be emphasized enough, giving the Ukrainians money matters, but it's not money that they need. What they need is equipment. They especially need artillery and tanks and fighting vehicles of one sort or another. And we don't have the equipment to give them. So we can give them dollar bills. We can give them lots of dollar bills, but you can't fight the Russians with dollar bills. What you need are artillery pieces.
And well-trained crew to fight them that's trained at every level. And you can't make those. You can't even buy those with dollar bills or anything else. That's one of the big problems.
Right. I mean, you and I both served in the American military. We know that it takes well over a year to train troops. And then you have to expose them to combat and get them battle tested and so forth and so on before they're really first-rate troops. And one of the reasons that the June 4th counteroffensive failed so abysmally was because the troops were not trained nearly well enough to launch some sort of classic blitzkrieg that cut through all those Russian defenses and ended up on the Sea of Azov. This was, a pipe dream. It just wasn't going to happen. They didn't have the trained troops, and you need highly trained troops. You need the Wehrmacht in 1940 if you're going to through those Russian forces.
And trained, and there's plenty of sizable. Now, so let me ask you this: given what's going on in both the House and the Senate, I mean, it's unclear right now if we're even going to avoid having a government shutdown in January and February, much less finding this consensus to be able to provide any money even for Ukraine. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that they come up with something, even if it's a small package that they end up passing here. What is going to happen especially in the winter, with Russia right now is kind of on a sustained, just methodical offensive across the whole front there. And right now, Ukraine is defending everywhere, and they're being pushed back, not big areas, but a little bit in every area. But there is no path. There's no even possibility that suddenly the Ukraine is going to turn things around after all the people they lost in this offensive over the summer. So what does that tell you about the prospects for 2024? Where do you see this going?
Well, it goes from bad to worse in 2024. There's no question about that. 2 points. One already made, and that is that we don't have the weaponry to give them. So in terms of the balance of artillery, the balance of tanks, the Ukrainians are going to be hopelessly outbalanced. But the other problem is that the Russians have mobilized huge numbers of troops. They mobilized 300,000 troops late last September. This is September 2022. And over the course of 2023, they have mobilized about 420,000 troops, and they will be mobilizing more troops in 2024. So the balance in terms of the number of fighting forces on each side is shifting in favor of the Russians in decisive ways. And you want to remember, Zelensky talks a lot about having a major mobilization inside Kyiv, but it's almost impossible for him to move in that direction. There are a tremendous number of draft dodgers in Ukraine, people who simply don't want to be put in the military. And any movement that Zelensky makes to draft people to go to a large-scale mobilization is going to meet huge resistance. So I think what's going to happen here is that the balance is going to continue to shift in terms of material and in terms of manpower against the Ukrainians, and they're going to lose.
What's adding problems to that is that you had, I think it was a week ago on Sunday, I believe it was, you had the new minister of defense for Ukraine, Umarov, I think his name is, saying that again, and he's repeated something that Zelensky said about a week before. Their objective is for 2024 is still to go back to the 1991 borders, which is just boggling my mind that they're still confidently saying, yes, that's the path. And at least at the White House level, they're still saying, yeah, we got to give them all the money they want for as long as they want. Not even talking about the issues you just did about the physical availability of equipment or training. But if we're pursuing what it appears to be as the unattainable, both politically, diplomatically, and militarily, then what's going to happen on the ground, do you think? Will Russia move forward and eventually, even if it's like meter by meter, go forward, or do you see a breakthrough possible?
Well, I think there will be either a breakthrough or the Russians in steamroller fashion will just push the Ukrainians back. And the Ukrainians in the process will, of course, do some serious retreating. I've read in a number of places where there's a serious possibility that the Ukrainians will retreat in the Kharkiv area and give up their gains from 2022 and move back to more defensible lines. Whether that happens or not remains to be seen. But there is talk about that at this point in time. Look, I think what's going to happen is the Russians are going to end up conquering not just the Crimea and the 4 oblasts in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine that they already control. I think they'll take 4 more oblasts. I think they'll take Kharkiv. I think they'll take Odessa. And I think they'll end up with roughly 40+% of Ukrainian territory. This is 1991 Ukrainian territory. And at the same time, they will go to great lengths to make sure that Ukraine is a dysfunctional rump state and in no position to join either the EU or NATO. This is going to be a total disaster for Ukraine. And the fact that Ukraine and the West don't see the writing on the wall and aren't moving to work out some sort of deal with the Russians boggles my mind. I find it hard to believe that these people are continuing to talk about winning against Russia and bringing Ukraine into NATO. This is like waving a red flag in front of a bull. It just gives the Russians more incentive than ever to capture more territory and to do more to wreck Ukraine. Just makes no sense to me.
Yeah, that's the most egregious thing about this, which we've been talking about here on Deep Dive for weeks now, actually more like months, is that by pursuing the unattainable, you're actually condemning more Ukrainian people to death, more Ukrainian cities turned into rubble, and eventually losing more territory that's necessary. I mean, I think that they could have had a negotiated settlement that would have left Kiev in control of most of even current Ukraine, even large parts of Donbass in March of 2022 at that Istanbul meeting. I think if they had pursued that, I think that this war could have been over long ago and they would have more going forward.
I agree 100%. I mean, it's hard to make this argument in the West because people like to portray Putin as the second coming of Adolf Hitler and being some sort of mindless aggressor. But the fact is, really, all that Putin wanted was a neutral Ukraine. And that was the principal issue on the table in the March-April 2022 negotiations that you were referencing. And once it was clear that the Ukrainians were willing to live with a neutral Ukraine, it looked like you were going to get a deal. That's the issue on the table. But we keep talking today, even though the Ukrainians are losing on the battlefield, about bringing them into NATO, which again is like, poking the Russians in the eye with a stick. Makes no sense.
What do you think is going to happen? And I know we're running low on time here. What do you think is going to happen when Zelensky shows up tomorrow in Washington? Because as I see that, it's a really high stakes gamble by both Biden and Zelensky, because Zelensky already canceled a meeting he was supposed to have with the House and Senate leaders by VTC last week because there was so much contention. And a lot of people didn't even want to talk to him about more funding. But if he physically comes here and they don't get, some large package of something, it's going to make the president look pretty weak, like he can't even produce anything here. And it's going to make, when Zelensky goes home empty-handed, it's going to undercut his position politically within Ukraine, I think.
Let me ask you this. Do you see any evidence that the Congress or the House is willing to concede on this issue?
When I saw Lindsey Graham actually backpedal last week and talk about, hey, no more funding for Ukraine until we get border funding, when he was the biggest cheerleader for them, I think that was a big sign that the answer is no.
Yeah, I mean, if you had asked me 2 months ago whether I thought we would be in a situation today where Congress would be cutting off money to Ukraine for the foreseeable future, I would have said it's not going to happen, to be honest. I thought the moral commitment here alone would have compelled us to give them at least some money. But it looks to me, from a distance anyway, that Congress, and here we're talking mainly about the House of Representatives, is deeply committed to making sure that Ukraine doesn't get that money unless Biden concedes on the border issue. And he doesn't seem like he's going to concede on that issue.
Yeah.
So it looks like, what I thought, 2 months ago or whatever was wrong.
And looking at the other half of this equation, it looks to me like things in Moscow are looking pretty cheery from their perspective, because I think that Putin is still willing to expend a lot more money, troops, and time, because I think he sees that the writing on the wall as well. He does see the writing on the wall. You claim that we don't see on our side. And I believe it was earlier today that I saw Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman for the foreign ministry in Russia, when asked, are they willing to have a negotiation? And she basically said, hey, until we get all of the 4 oblasts we're talking about, we're not even interested in talking about any negotiated settlement, because I don't think they have to compromise with anything, because I think that they're in a position of negotiated superiority. How do you see Putin's position right now, and what do you see things from his perspective in 2024?
Well, I think you can tell from his body language that things are going very well for him. He has a real bounce in his step. He looks a lot different today than he did in March or June of 2022.
Yeah, that is so true.
Yeah, so I think he's in the catbird seat at this point in time. The problem moving forward for him is that he's got to be careful if he tries to work out a deal with the West and with Ukraine, that he doesn't come up with an arrangement that the West and Ukraine can welch on down the road and leave him in a bad position. In other words, he understands full well that he can't trust the West and he can't trust Ukraine. So that gives him a very powerful incentive to grab as much territory as possible, and furthermore, to weaken Ukraine as much as possible. So I think
that's why you say you think he's going to get 4 additional provinces before, talking about a negotiated settlement.
Yeah, I think that's what will happen. And at the same time, as I emphasized, I think that he'll try to keep Ukraine as a dysfunctional rump state. He will interfere in the politics of Ukraine, cause all sorts of trouble, and he will do everything he can to weaken the economy. And that won't be difficult to do, because if he takes Odessa, he'll control the entire Black Sea coastline. Right. He's already taken a lot of prime real estate and a lot of the industrial base of Ukraine.
And how long do you from what to what? How long do you think it might take for him to realize that, given current conditions?
It's very hard to say.
Yeah.
I would guess by the end of 2024, but it's just a guess. Danny, one of the questions I ask myself all the time is whether or not the Ukrainian military might shatter at some point in time, much the way the French army mutinied in the spring of 1917. And it's just very hard to tell. It's truly impressive. The staying power of the Ukrainian army is truly impressive. Just watching them in operation, you have the sense that they won't break, that they'll hang in there, and they'll make it exceedingly difficult for the Russians to capture more territory. And therefore, the Russians won't get those additional 4 oblasts. But at the same time, given the unwillingness of so many Ukrainians to now serve in the military, and given the pounding that the existing forces are taking, the war weariness, the lack of artillery shells, you say to yourself, at some point, this military has to collapse or shatter. Yeah. So that might happen. I can't say for sure. But it's just very hard for me to see that army, the Ukrainian army, despite the Herculean effort they've made up to now, hanging in there for the long term.
So let me ask you this before we let you go. I'd love to put our guest in the catbird, in the hot seat, actually, and ask them this question. let's say that President Biden was watching this show and he's like, "Wow, you know what? You're right on a lot of this stuff. What should I do?" If the president asked you today, "What should I do?" Given all of the mess that we've had, all the bad policies, everything that's happened, the current situation, the realistic situation, what would you advise the White House to do right now?
Well, I think there is a solution, and there's a good chance you could get the Russians to go along with it. Uh, the first and the key ingredient would be for Biden to agree that NATO will break off all relations with Ukraine, that the United States is committed to a neutral Ukraine, no security relationship between the West and especially the United States and Ukraine. That's number one. And then number two, you have to accept the fact that the Russians are going to take Crimea, and they're going to take almost all of those four oblasts, maybe all of the four oblasts that they have now formally annexed. And you just have to live with the fact that roughly 23% of Ukraine is gone. I think if you were to do that, and especially if you could convince the Russians that the West will not come back and start the fight again, then you stand a reasonable chance of getting a real peace agreement, not just a frozen conflict. But the problem is, if I told Biden that, he'd tell me to go jump in the lake. He would say that's just impossible. We got to fight the Russians. We got to beat the Russians. The Ukrainians can do it, and we're just going to hang in there.
Yeah, well, I mean that is what they're saying right now. But what that's going to end up doing, the most likely course, is that it's going to turn in not 23%, but 40% of Ukraine gone, and then no one gets a choice. Then Biden doesn't get to make any decisions. Zelensky doesn't get to make any decisions. It's basically surrender on these terms, and Russia's going to end there because Russia, as you said, doesn't want to conquer all of Ukraine, because then that would be, number one, taking on a cancerous sore in the western part that they don't want to have to occupy indefinitely. But it also then would put them right on the edge of NATO. They want to leave this weakened rump in between the two and let them handle their own affairs, so they don't have to get involved with that morass. But then they keep their security. So I think that either Biden shows the leadership and does the hard thing that you just talked about, or I think we condemn Ukraine to a loss of potentially 40% of their country.
Danny, just to pursue this a bit more, during the Cold War, as we both know, the Soviet Union occupied a huge chunk of Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, the Baltic states, so forth and so on. And it was an exceedingly difficult task to occupy those countries. They had to put down a major insurrection in Germany, East Germany, in 1953. They went into Hungary in 1956. They went into Czechoslovakia in 1968. They almost went into Poland 3 separate times. And then they had to deal with the Albanians and the Romanians, who were really a giant pain in the rear end for the Russians or for the Soviets. So they've been there, done that, and they're not interested in doing that again. Yeah. And this is why Putin was so interested in working out some sort of arrangement in March, April of 2022, where Ukraine became a neutral state. And as you said, it looked like Putin was willing to abandon the Donbass even at that point in time. I don't think he would have abandoned Crimea, but he would have abandoned the Donbass in all likelihood. He's not interested in occupying territory where he will run into resistance. And therefore, it would have been easy to get a deal. And what's tragic about this whole situation, it makes me sick to my stomach, is that if we had not pursued NATO expansion into Ukraine, if there had been no decision in April of 2008 to bring Ukraine into NATO, I believe Ukraine would, in all likelihood, be intact today. The Russians would not own a huge chunk of Ukrainian territory, in all likelihood. Yeah. But we blew it. And this is why I've long argued that we are principally responsible for this disaster.
Yeah. And on top of that, I think that especially if the latter possibility of losing 40% comes to pass, there'll be a day when people would long to get the deal that they could have had in March, April of 2022, but it'll be too late then because it'll be too late today because we just don't have the capacity, the leadership capacity to do the hard, right thing. I think that's the bottom line here.
Yeah.
Well, we'll go ahead and leave it there for now. And Professor, thank you so much for coming on our show today. It's been very enlightening. We really appreciate it. And I really hope that President Biden does tune in because he could sure benefit from your advice. Thank you for coming on.
My pleasure, Danny. Thank you for having me.
And that's all we have for you today. We have remained unintimidated and uncompromising, giving you the information you need to make sense of your world and giving you advice or information like this to help you see that there is a solution to these things. Some of these problems aren't intractable. We just need leadership to do them. Thank you very much. Be sure to like and subscribe and share with all your friends so that they can benefit from this too. And we'll see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.